Hello everyone and welcome to another video. In this video we'll be looking at port forwarding on the CM685VX router. Although the configuration is very similar for all of the CM685 routers as well as the CM820, CM770 and CM950 routers. Port forwarding is basically a form of network address translation which maps an external port to an internal IP address and port number. This allows devices in private networks to connect to other devices or services in different networks via the internet. For example, in this video, I'm going to be setting up port forwarding for an IP camera. Typically, to access or configure this camera, you'd have to be located on the same private network. However, with port forwarding, this camera could be installed on an external site somewhere, and I'll be able to access and configure it from anywhere. Before we get started, you'll need to know the internal IP address and port number of the device you want to set up port forwarding for. If you're using something like an IP camera, it should come with its own instructions on how to do this. Once you've got that, our first step is to set up our Comset router with a public IP address. This will let us connect to our router remotely. To do this, you first might have to check with your network provider to make sure that your SIM can have a public IP. Once you're sure that your SIM card can have a public IP, go to Network, and then Mobile, and then enter your provider's relevant public APN. For Telstra SIMs, this will be telstra.extranet. And then once you've done that, click Save and Apply. If we then go back to the status overview page and check the IP address here, we can see it's now in the range of public IPs. Now with Telstra, this IP address is dynamic, so it will change after a certain period of time or when the router restarts. And since we want to use this address for remote access, ideally we'd want a static public IP. However, we can work around this using dynamic DNS. This gives our router a set host name, which we can use instead of the IP address to access the router remotely. To do this, go to Services and then DDNS. And here we can either create a new DDNS configuration or we can just edit this example here. Under Basic Settings, make sure you tick Enabled and then select your DDNS provider from the drop-down menu. I'm using this one here. Next, enter a host name that you have set up with your DDNS provider. And then enter your username and your password that you have with that provider. When you're done with that, click Save and Apply. Once that's finished saving, it will take you back to the DDNS overview and make sure you hit Start on your configuration. Next, we need to change our router's firewall settings. So go to Network and then Firewall and then go across to Security. Scroll down to HTTP Access and change HTTP Access from WAN to Allow. So now we'll be able to access our router remotely. Now, if your device for port forwarding has a port number of 80, to avoid conflict, you have to change the port number here. My camera has an internal port number of 88, which would be fine, but I'm going to change it just to show you how it's done. So I'm going to make this port number 8080. Once you've done all that, scroll down and click Save and Apply. Now, if you've changed that port number, your browser will probably tell you that this page can't be reached. This is perfectly fine. Just go up to the browser search bar, enter the router's IP address followed by a colon and then the new HTTP port number. And then we will have to log back into our router. Now we're ready to create a new port forwarding rule. So back under Network and Firewall, go to the Port Forwards tab and then where it says New Port Forward, give your new rule a name. I'm just going to call mine IP Camera 1. And then I'll leave the protocol as TCP and UDP. For the external port, this is the port number we use to access the device remotely. I'm just going to make this the next port number after my HTTP port, so 8081. You could make this anything, just as long as it avoids conflicts with already assigned port numbers. And then the internal IP address is the internal IP address or private IP address of our camera or other device. And then the internal port is its port number. When you're done, click Add and then Save and Apply. Now we should be able to access the web interface remotely of our IP camera or other device. To test this out, I'm going to disconnect the LAN port of my router from my PC and connect it instead to my camera. So first I'll just check that my DDNS is working by typing in my host name, followed by a colon, and then the new port number that I assigned. So that successfully loads the web interface of my router, meaning that the DDNS is working correctly. Then if I change the port number at the end to 8081, which is the external port number in my forwarding rule, it will load the web interface of my camera, meaning that I can now access and configure this camera remotely. So that's all for this video. We have successfully set up port forwarding on our CM685VX router so that we can access a device like an IP camera from outside of the private network. Thank you all for watching. See you in the next video.